Lyra didn't know that the man watching her from the shadows at the bride market was the Alpha King. She didn't know he'd been searching for her for 3 years, following the faintest trace of her scent through a dozen kingdoms. And she certainly didn't know that her stepfather's greedy transaction was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the marketplace as Lyra adjusted the ill-fitting dress her stepmother had forced her into. The blue fabric, borrowed from a neighbour and too tight across her chest, made her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life, which, she supposed, she was. "Stand straighter," her stepfather Marcus hissed, his meaty hand gripping her elbow. "You look like a beaten dog." Lyra straightened her spine, though every instinct told her to curl inward. 3 years of living under Marcus's roof had taught her that resistance only brought more pain. Better to endure, better to survive. The bride market bustled around them with the casual cruelty of commerce. Young women stood on wooden platforms while potential husbands examined them like livestock, checking teeth and asking about childbearing hips. The sound of coins changing hands mixed with nervous laughter and muffled sobs. "Remember," Marcus continued, his breath reeking of cheap ale, "Lord Garrett has already paid your bride price. This is just a formality to see if anyone wants to bid higher." He chuckled, the sound ugly in the morning air. "Not that anyone would want damaged goods like you." Damaged goods. The words settled into Lyra's chest like stones, joining the collection she'd been carrying since her parents died. Orphaned, burdened, worthless. The litany of her failures played on repeat in her mind as Marcus guided her toward the platform. She'd known this day would come eventually. Marcus had made it clear from the moment he'd inherited her along with her father's debts that she was nothing more than a commodity to be traded. The surprise was that anyone wanted her at all. Lord Garrett stood near the front of the crowd, his pale eyes tracking her movement with the intensity of a predator. He was older than her father would have been, with greying hair and hands that had already wandered too freely during their brief meetings. The memory of his touch made her skin crawl. "Up you go," Marcus said, practically shoving her onto the platform. The wooden boards creaked under her feet as Lyra found her place in the centre. The crowd's attention settled on her like a weight, and she fought the urge to wrap her arms around herself. Instead, she kept her hands at her sides and her eyes fixed on a point just above the spectators' heads. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the marketplace with practised ease, "I present my stepdaughter Lyra, 18 years old, healthy and trained in household management." A few interested murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks as strange men evaluated her like a horse at auction. "Now, Lord Garrett has already made a generous offer," Marcus continued, pulling a heavy purse from his coat. 50 gold pieces for immediate marriage, but I'm a fair man. If anyone would like to make a higher bid, I'm willing to listen." 50 gold pieces, the amount her life was worth, apparently. Lyra closed her eyes briefly, accepting the reality of her situation. At least with Lord Garrett, she knew what to expect. Better the devil you knew. The crowd murmured among themselves, but no one stepped forward. Why would they? She had no dowry, no connections, no particular beauty to recommend her. She was exactly what Marcus claimed, damaged goods being sold to pay a dead man's debts. 50 going once, Marcus announced, grinning at Lord Garrett's satisfied expression. 50 going twice. 100. The voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and commanding. Every head turned toward the sound, including Lyra's. Her breath caught in her throat. A man stood at the edge of the marketplace, partially hidden in the shadow of a merchant's tent. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the morning light and eyes that seemed to burn gold even from a distance. He wore simple travelling clothes, but something about the way he carried himself spoke of power barely contained. "Did someone say 100?" Marcus sputtered, his greedy excitement palpable. The stranger stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him like water. Each step was measured, predatory, and entirely focused on Lyra. When their eyes met across the distance, something electric shot through her, a warmth that started in her chest and spread outward until her skin tingled. 100 gold pieces, the man repeated, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent marketplace. Paid immediately. Lord Garrett's face flushed red. This is irregular. I had an agreement. Which can be superseded by a higher offer, the stranger said smoothly, never taking his eyes off Lyra. Unless you'd like to match my bid? Garrett's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. 100 gold pieces was more than most men saw in a lifetime. The stranger seemed to know this as he pulled a leather purse from his belt, the clink of coins unmistakable. "Sold!" Marcus declared before Garrett could find his voice. 100 gold pieces to the gentleman! The stranger approached the platform, and Lyra found herself unable to look away. Up close, his features were sharper, more defined. There was something wild about him, something that called to a part of her she didn't recognize. "My name is Matthias," he said, extending his hand to help her down from the platform. His voice was gentler now, meant for her ears alone. "You're safe now." Safe. The word was foreign on her tongue. "I don't even know you," she whispered, her hand hovering over his. "You don't need to know me," he replied, his golden eyes steady on hers. "You just need to trust me." Trust. Another foreign concept. But something about his presence, the way he looked at her like she was precious rather than disposable, made her want to try. Lyra placed her hand in his, and the warmth that had been building in her chest exploded into something she couldn't name. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never been, like recognition without memory. Matthias's fingers closed around hers, strong and sure, and he helped her down from the platform with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. "The money!" Marcus demanded, thrusting himself between them. Matthias released Lyra's hand, long enough to toss the heavy purse to her stepfather. "As agreed, she comes with me now." "Wait!" Lord Garrett stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. "This is highly irregular. There are contracts, agreements—" "Which have been superseded by a better offer," Matthias said, his voice taking on an edge that made several people in the crowd step back. "Unless you'd like to discuss it further." There was something in his tone, some underlying threat, that made Garrett pale and retreat without another word. "Come," Matthias said, turning back to Lyra and offering his arm. "Let's go home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Lyra glanced back at Marcus, who was already counting his coins with gleeful avarice, then at the crowd of strangers who had just witnessed her sail like it was entertainment. "What if I don't want to go with you?" she asked quietly, though even as she said it, she knew she did. Something in her recognized him, responded to him in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. Matthias paused, his hand still extended. "Then I'll wait until you do," he said simply. "But I won't let you go back to that." He nodded toward Marcus. "You deserve better than being sold to pay another man's debts." Deserve, another word that felt strange in connection to herself, but the way he said it, with such quiet certainty, made her want to believe it might be true. Lyra took his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his shirt. As they walked away from the marketplace together, she caught a glimpse of Lord Garrett's furious expression. "He's going to cause trouble," she murmured. Matthias glanced down at her, something dangerous flickering in his golden eyes. "Let him try," he said quietly. "He can't touch you now. You're under my protection." Protection. The concept was as foreign as all the others, but wrapped in his steady presence it almost felt real, almost felt possible. As they left the sounds of the marketplace behind them, Lyra found herself walking beside a stranger who had just bought her freedom with more gold than she'd ever seen. She should be afraid. She should be planning her escape. Instead, for the first time in 3 years, she felt something that might have been hope. The estate rose from the hillside, like something from a dream, all white stone and soaring towers that caught the afternoon light. Lyra pressed closer to the carriage window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at what could only be a palace. "This is where you live?" she whispered. Matthias smiled, the expression transforming his sharp features into something warmer. "This is where we live," he corrected gently. "We—" The word sent another one of those strange electric jolts through her chest. Lyra had lived her entire life as an afterthought, a burden to be endured. The concept of being part of a we felt impossibly foreign. The carriage rolled through gates that gleamed with gold inlay, past gardens more elaborate than anything she'd seen in storybooks. Servants lined the drive, all of them bowing deeply as their carriage passed. "Why are they—" Lyra began, then stopped as realization crept up her spine like ice water. The servants weren't bowing to the carriage, they were bowing to the man sitting across from her. "Your Majesty," the footman said as he opened the carriage door, his voice filled with reverence that made Lyra's stomach drop. "Welcome home." "Your Majesty." Lyra's hands trembled as Matthias stepped down first, then turned to help her out. The servant's eyes tracked their joined hands with barely concealed curiosity, and she felt heat rush to her cheeks. "Breathe," Matthias murmured, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it almost broke her composure entirely. A woman in an elegant black dress approached, her silver hair pinned in a perfect chignon. "Your Majesty," she said, curtsying gracefully, "I've prepared the guest chambers as you requested." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," Matthias replied. "Please have dinner sent to my private dining room. We have much to discuss." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flicked to Lyra with poorly concealed shock. "Of course, Your Majesty. Will there be anything else the young lady requires?" "Everything," Matthias said simply. "She'll need everything." As they walked through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced royalty, Lyra felt the weight of their gazes like physical things. Generations of kings and queens stared down at her in her borrowed blue dress, and she'd never felt more out of place. "Matthias," she said quietly, then caught herself. "I mean, Your Majesty, I don't understand. You're the king." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the golden light streaming through tall windows, his eyes seemed to burn with their own fire. "I'm the Alpha King," he said, "and you're my mate." Mate? The word hit her like a physical blow. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I don't have a wolf. I've never shifted, never felt any kind of—" "Connection?" he finished, stepping closer. "Never felt like there was something missing, some part of yourself you couldn't find?" Lyra's breath caught. Because yes, she had felt that. Every day of her life she'd felt incomplete, like she was only half of something that should have been whole. "For 3 years," Matthias continued, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that made her skin warm, "I've been searching for you, following the faintest trace of your scent, the whisper of a dream I couldn't quite remember. I knew you existed somewhere. I knew you were waiting." "But I'm nobody," Lyra protested, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm an orphan with no pack, no family, no—" "You're everything," he said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice made tears spring to her eyes. "You're mine, and I'm yours, and that's all that matters." Mine. The possessive word should have frightened her. Instead, it sent warmth spreading through her chest like honey. "I need to show you something," Matthias said, taking her hand again. He led her deeper into the palace, through a doorway that opened onto a private balcony overlooking the gardens. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the strange warmth building between them. "Close your eyes," he said softly. "Why?" "Trust me." Trust. There was that word again. Lyra closed her eyes, acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way his scent seemed to wrap around her like safety itself. "Now," Matthias murmured, his voice closer than before, "tell me what you feel." At first there was nothing but the evening breeze and the distant sound of fountains. Then, gradually, Lyra became aware of something else. a warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun, a pull that seemed to emanate from the very centre of her being. "I feel—" she started, then stopped, unsure how to put the sensation into words. "Like coming home," Matthias suggested. Her eyes snapped open to find him watching her with an intensity that stole her breath. "How did you—" "Because I feel it too," he said. "I felt it the moment I saw you in that marketplace. The recognition, the certainty. You're what I've been missing." "This is insane," Lyra whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it was true. Whatever was happening between them, it was real and undeniable and terrifying in its intensity. "Look," Matthias said softly, taking her hand and pressing it against his chest. The moment their skin touched, light blazed between them. Golden threads of luminescence danced around their joined hands, visible and beautiful and impossible. Lyra gasped, trying to pull away, but Matthias held her gently in place. "Don't be afraid," he murmured. "It's just our bond. It's showing itself because you're finally ready to see." "Bond," she repeated faintly, staring at the golden light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "The mate bond," Matthias confirmed. "What connects us? What makes us whole? It's been there all along, waiting for you to accept it." The light faded gradually, but the warmth remained, spreading through Lyra's entire body until she felt more alive than she had in years. "I don't understand any of this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You will," Matthias said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "We have time." Time. Something she'd never had enough of, always rushing from one crisis to the next, always fighting just to survive. "Tell me about yourself," Matthias said, leading her to a bench overlooking the gardens. "Tell me about your life before today." So she did. Hesitantly at first, then with growing courage, Lyra told him about her parents' death, about Marcus and his debts, about years of being treated like an unwanted burden. She told him about scrubbing floors until her hands bled, about going to bed hungry so there would be enough food for Marcus's real children, about the constant reminder that she was worth nothing more than the coins in a man's purse. Matthias listened without interruption, but she could see the anger building in his golden eyes, the way his jaw tightened with each cruel detail. "I should have found you sooner," he said when she finished, his voice rough with regret. "You found me when I needed you most," Lyra replied, and realized she meant it. "And what about you?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "What's it like being an Alpha King?" A shadow crossed his features. "Lonely," he said simply. "For 3 years, everyone has been pushing me to choose a political bride, to secure alliances through marriage, but I couldn't. I knew my mate was out there somewhere, and marrying anyone else would have been a betrayal of what we could have." 3 years, Lyra murmured. "You waited 3 years for someone you'd never met?" "I waited for you," he corrected. "Even when I didn't know your name, didn't know your face. I knew you existed, and that was enough." The golden warmth in her chest pulsed stronger, and for the first time in her life, Lyra felt truly valued, not for what she could do or provide, but simply for being herself. "Dinner is served, Your Majesty," Mrs. Whitmore announced from the doorway. The private dining room was smaller than Lyra had expected, intimate rather than grand. Candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the table was set for 2, with china so delicate it looked like it might shatter at a touch. "This is too much," Lyra protested, as servants brought course after course of food, more elaborate than anything she'd ever tasted. "This is how you deserve to be treated," Matthias said firmly. "Like the queen you are." Queen. The title felt impossible, absurd. Queens were elegant and educated and sophisticated. They weren't orphaned servants who'd been sold in marketplaces. As if reading her thoughts, Matthias reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You're thinking too loudly," he said with gentle humour. "I don't know how to be what you need," Lyra admitted. "I don't know how to be a queen." You don't have to know, Matthias said. You just have to be yourself. The rest will come. The golden bond pulsed between them again, and Lyra felt some of her panic subside. Maybe she didn't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to take things one moment at a time. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. A guard entered, his face grim. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply. "Forgive the interruption, but there's been a development. Lord Garrett has filed a formal complaint with the High Council. He's claiming the bride market transaction was invalid and demanding the lady's return." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Matthias's grip on Lyra's hand tightened protectively, and she could see the wolf stirring behind his golden eyes. "On what grounds?" Matthias asked, his voice deadly calm. "A breach of prior contract and irregular bidding procedures, Your Majesty. He's demanding a formal hearing." Lyra's stomach turned to ice. "He can do that?" "He can try," Matthias said, but there was something in his tone that made her even more afraid. "Thank you, Captain Reynolds. Have our legal counsel prepare a response." "At once, Your Majesty." When they were alone again, Lyra pulled her hand free and stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "This is because of me," she said, "because I'm not worth the trouble I'm causing." "No." The word came out like a growl, and suddenly Matthias was behind her, his hands gentle but firm on her shoulders. "This is because Garrett is a small man who can't accept that something precious slipped through his fingers." "Precious," Lyra repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "Precious," Matthias confirmed, turning her to face him. "Worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth everything." The golden bond blazed between them again, stronger this time, and Lyra felt his absolute certainty wash over her like a tide. For the first time since the guard's announcement, she could breathe again. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Matthias said, his eyes burning with fierce protectiveness, "we show them exactly what happens when someone tries to take what belongs to the Alpha King." The possessive edge to his words should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safer than she'd ever felt in her life. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. For the first time in 3 years, Lyra wasn't fighting just to survive. She was fighting for something worth having. She was fighting for home. The summons arrived at dawn, delivered by a courier whose face was grim with the weight of official business. Lyra watched from the window of her chambers as Matthias read the formal parchment, his jaw tightening with each line. "The High Council commands your presence within 3 days," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "They're invoking the ancient laws of contract dispute." Lyra's stomach dropped. She'd spent a restless night in the most comfortable bed she'd ever known, but comfort couldn't quiet the voice in her head that whispered she didn't belong here. Now, it seemed, the voice was right. "They can overturn the sale?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the set of his shoulders. "They can try," Matthias said, but there was something in his tone that made her chest tighten with fear. "The ancient laws are complicated. They predate modern contract law." Which means if Garrett can prove prior claim or breach of traditional marriage protocols, he might have grounds for appeal. Lyra sank into the chair by the window, her borrowed nightgown suddenly feeling like a costume she had no right to wear. "I should go back to him," she said quietly, "before this becomes a war." "No." The word came out like a growl, and suddenly Matthias was kneeling before her chair, his hands covering hers. "Don't even think it." "But I'm not worth—" "You're worth everything," he interrupted fiercely. "You're worth my kingdom, my crown, my life. Don't you understand that?" The golden bond pulsed between them, warm and steady, but Lyra pulled her hands free. "I'm one person," she whispered. "One insignificant person who's causing you political trouble. Your advisers must think you've lost your mind." Matthias was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was softer. "My council has been pressuring me to marry for political advantage for years. They want alliances with neighbouring kingdoms, trade agreements sealed with wedding vows. They see my refusal to choose a bride as weakness." "Maybe they're right," Lyra said, hating herself for the words even as they left her mouth. "They're fools," Matthias said simply. "A king who abandons his mate for political convenience is no king at all." 3 days later, Lyra stood before the gilded doors of the High Council chamber, wearing a dress of deep blue silk that cost more than Marcus had ever spent on her in 3 years. Matthias had insisted on the royal colours, had placed a simple gold circlet on her head that felt heavier than a crown. "You're not a supplicant," he told her as they prepared. "You're my queen. Remember that." Queen. The word still felt impossible, especially here in the ancient seat of werewolf law, where portraits of legendary alphas lined the walls with eyes that seemed to judge her every breath. The chamber doors opened with a resonance that echoed through Lyra's bones. Inside, 7 elderly wolves sat in carved chairs that resembled thrones, their faces stern with the weight of centuries-old tradition. Lord Garrett stood to one side with his allies, his pale eyes fixed on her with triumphant hatred. He wore ceremonial robes that declared his noble bloodline, surrounded by supporters whose wealth and power radiated from them like heat. "Your Majesty," Elder Councilman Voss said, inclining his head to Matthias with respectful formality, "you honour us with your presence." "Elder Voss," Matthias replied, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. "I trust this matter will be resolved swiftly and justly." "That depends," Voss said, his eyes shifting to Lyra with barely concealed disapproval, "on the evidence presented." Lord Garrett stepped forward, producing a scroll with a flourish. "Honourable Council," he began, his voice carrying across the chamber, "I present evidence of breach of contract and unlawful interference with legitimate commerce." Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as Garrett unrolled the parchment. She recognised her stepfather's crude handwriting, the official seal that had once seemed so important. "This document," Garrett continued, "shows a binding pre-agreement for marriage between myself and the woman in question, signed and witnessed 3 months ago with bride price paid in advance." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Lyra felt the weight of dozens of eyes, all of them seeing exactly what Marcus had always told her she was, damaged goods being fought over by men who saw her as property. "Furthermore," Garrett continued, his confidence growing, "the marketplace transaction violated established protocols for noble marriages. No proper announcements were made, no time given for legitimate claimants to respond. The entire proceeding was irregular." Elder Voss examined the contract with careful attention. "These are serious allegations, Lord Garrett. If proven, they would indeed invalidate the subsequent sale." "The contract is meaningless," Matthias said, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. "It was signed under duress by a man selling his stepdaughter to pay gambling debts. That hardly constitutes a legitimate marriage agreement." "Nevertheless," Voss replied, "it appears to be legally binding under traditional law." Lyra watched the proceedings with growing horror. Legal arguments flew over her head, but the meaning was clear. She was being treated exactly like the commodity Marcus had always claimed she was, property to be assigned to whoever had the stronger legal claim. "If I may address the council," she said, her voice barely audible. The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to her, and Lyra felt her courage falter under their collective gaze. She was nobody, an orphaned servant girl who had no right to speak in these hallowed halls. But then she felt it, the golden warmth of the bond, steady and strong, flowing from Matthias like a lifeline. When she looked at him, his eyes held absolute faith in her. "I may have been sold," Lyra said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "but I was never asked what I wanted, not by my stepfather, not by Lord Garrett, not by anyone." "The law doesn't require your consent," Garrett sneered. "You're a minor ward without independent status." "I'm 18 years old," Lyra replied, lifting her chin. "Old enough to choose my own fate." "You have no legal standing to—" "She has every right to speak," Matthias interrupted, his alpha authority filling the chamber like a physical force. "As my chosen mate." The words hung in the air like thunder. Lyra felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the bond and everything to do with being defended, being valued, being seen as more than property. "Chosen mate," Elder Voss repeated thoughtfully. "A serious claim, Your Majesty. Can you provide evidence of this bond?" "I can," Matthias said simply. He stepped toward Lyra, extending his hand. "If the council will permit a demonstration." Lyra's breath caught. She understood what he was asking. To reveal their bond publicly, to make their connection visible to the most powerful wolves in the kingdom. Once seen, it couldn't be denied or dismissed. She placed her hand in his. The golden light blazed immediately, stronger than it had ever been before. Threads of luminescence danced around their joined hands, pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeats, creating patterns of light that filled the chamber with warm radiance. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Even the stone-faced council members leaned forward, their eyes wide with wonder. The mate bond was legendary, spoken of in ancient texts, but rarely witnessed in living memory. "Impossible," Garrett breathed, his face pale with shock. "The moon has spoken," Matthias said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This woman is my destined mate, marked by divine will. No contract written by mortal hands can supersede the judgment of the goddess herself." The golden light pulsed brighter, and Lyra felt something awakening deep within her, a power she'd never known she possessed, a strength that had been sleeping until this moment. "Furthermore," Elder Voss said slowly, his eyes fixed on the dancing light, "the presence of a mate bond invalidates all previous marriage contracts. Traditional law is quite clear on this point." Garrett's face twisted with rage. "This is a trick, some sort of magical deception." "Are you questioning the authenticity of a divine bond?" Matthias asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Are you suggesting the moon goddess herself is capable of deception?" The challenge hung in the air like a sword. To question a mate bond was tantamount to blasphemy, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Garrett sputtered, his confidence crumbling. However, Elder Councilman Blackwood spoke for the first time, his voice dry as autumn leaves. "There is still the matter of irregular proceedings to consider." Lyra's heart sank. Even with the bond proven, they were looking for reasons to invalidate it. "The ancient laws require proper trial by combat when a mate bond is disputed," Blackwood continued. "If Lord Garrett wishes to maintain his claim despite divine evidence, he may invoke the right of challenge. Trial by combat." The words sent ice through Lyra's veins. She'd heard stories of such challenges, brutal fights to the death where the winner claimed not just victory, but the right to possession of the disputed party. "I invoke that right," Garrett declared immediately. "I call for trial by combat to determine rightful ownership." "Ownership," Matthias repeated, the word carrying deadly promise. "You speak of my mate as property." "I speak of a woman who was legally mine before your interference," Garrett shot back. "If you truly believe your claim is stronger, prove it in honest combat." The chamber erupted in whispers. Lyra felt the world tilting around her as she realized what was happening. Two men were about to fight to the death for the right to possess her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "The challenge is acknowledged," Elder Voss announced formally. "The trial will take place at dawn, 3 days hence. Terms are combat to submission or death, with the victor claiming undisputed right to the woman." "No," Lyra whispered, but her voice was lost in the formal proceedings. As the council dismissed, Garrett approached with a smile that made her skin crawl. "I'll see you soon, my dear," he said quietly, "and when I win, you'll learn the price of defying your betters." Matthias stepped between them before Garrett could come closer, his eyes burning with golden fire. "Touch her," he said softly, "and I'll kill you before the trial even begins." Garrett retreated, but his smile never wavered. 3 days, Your Majesty. I hope you've made peace with your goddess." As they left the chamber, Lyra felt the weight of what was coming crushing down on her. In 3 days, the man she was beginning to love would risk his life for her, and if he lost, she would belong to a monster who saw her as nothing more than a prize to be won. The golden bond pulsed between them, warm and reassuring, but even its comfort couldn't quiet the voice in her head that whispered she would be the death of them both. She was no longer just a burden to be sold. She had become something far more dangerous. She had become worth fighting for. Dawn broke grey and cold over the ancient arena, mist rising from the stone seats like the breath of ghosts. Lyra stood at the balcony railing of the royal box, her hands gripping the marble so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Below, the circular arena stretched wide and empty, waiting for blood. "You don't have to watch," Matthias said quietly behind her. She turned to find him already dressed in simple combat leathers, no ceremonial armour or royal insignia, just a man preparing to fight for the woman he loved. "Yes, I do," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you're willing to die for me, the least I can do is witness it." His golden eyes softened, and he stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands. "I'm not going to die," he said with quiet certainty. "I'm going to win, and then I'm going to claim you before every witness in this kingdom." The golden bond pulsed between them, warm despite the morning chill. Lyra leaned into his touch, memorizing the feel of his hands, the intensity in his eyes, the way he looked at her like she was worth any sacrifice. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. If something goes wrong, if you can't win, don't die for me. Please, I couldn't live with that." Matthias's expression grew fierce. "I'm not losing you. Not to him, not to anyone. You're mine and I'm yours, and that's not changing today." Mine. The possessive word sent warmth through her chest, chasing away some of the cold fear. A horn sounded in the distance, the call for combatants to present themselves. Matthias kissed her forehead gently, a benediction and a promise. "Watch me win," he said simply, then turned and walked away. The arena filled gradually as the sun climbed higher. Thousands of spectators packed the stone seats, their voices creating a low rumble of anticipation. This wasn't just a trial by combat, it was entertainment, a spectacle that would be talked about for years. Elder Voss stood in the royal box beside Lyra, his ancient face grave. "Are you prepared for what you might witness, child?" he asked quietly. "No," Lyra admitted, "but I'm here anyway." "Good," Voss said with surprising warmth. "A queen must witness both victory and defeat with equal courage." Queen. The title still felt foreign, but less impossible than it had 3 days ago. Win or lose, she was no longer the frightened girl who'd stood on the auction platform. She was someone worth fighting for. A roar rose from the crowd as the arena doors opened. Garrett's champion entered first. A mountain of a man called Darius, who moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Scars crisscrossed his bare chest, each one a testament to previous victories. The crowd cheered his name with bloodthirsty enthusiasm. "Undefeated in 30 battles," Elder Voss murmured. "Lord Garrett chose his champion well." Lyra's stomach clenched as she took in Darius's massive frame, the casual way he rolled his shoulders like a man preparing for light exercise rather than mortal combat. How could anyone, even an Alpha King, stand against such brutal efficiency? The opposite door opened, and Matthias stepped into the arena. He looked smaller than his opponent, leaner, but he moved with a predator's grace that made Darius's confidence seem suddenly less certain. When Matthias lifted his head to scan the crowd, his eyes found hers immediately across the distance. The golden bond flared between them, visible even in daylight, and the crowd gasped as threads of light connected them across the arena. Lyra felt his certainty flow through their connection, his absolute faith in their destiny. "I fight for love!" Matthias called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Not for law, not for politics, not for pride. I fight for the woman who is my heart, my soul, my everything." The crowd erupted in approval. Whatever they thought of the politics, they recognised the romance of it. A king risking everything for his mate. Lord Garrett stood in his own viewing box, his face twisted with rage and anticipation. "Begin!" he shouted before the formal ceremonies were complete. Elder Voss raised his hand for silence. "Let the trial commence," he announced formally. "Combat to submission or death. May the moon judge truly." The two men circled each other warily. Darius struck first, a brutal overhand blow that would have crushed a normal man's skull. But Matthias was already moving, slipping aside with fluid grace and landing a quick strike to his opponent's ribs. The crowd roared its approval. What followed was a dance of violence more beautiful and terrible than anything Lyra had ever witnessed. Darius was larger, stronger, his fists like hammers that cracked the arena stones when Matthias dodged. But Matthias was faster, smarter, using his opponent's size against him. For long minutes they traded blows, neither gaining clear advantage. Blood flowed from cuts on both men, and Lyra found herself gripping the railing so hard her hands cramped. Then Darius landed a solid hit. Matthias staggered backward, blood streaming from a split lip, and for a moment Lyra's heart stopped entirely. The big man pressed his advantage, raining blows that drove the Alpha King to his knees. "Get up!" Lyra whispered, then louder, "Get up!" As if he heard her across the distance, Matthias lifted his head. Their eyes met, and she saw something shift in his expression. The golden bond between them blazed brighter, and suddenly Lyra felt power stirring deep within her chest. It started as warmth, then grew into something more, a presence awakening after years of slumber. Her wolf, dormant since childhood, began to stir. The power flowed through their bond, and Matthias's wounds began to heal, visibly. His split lip closed, his movements became fluid again, and when he rose to his feet, golden fire burned in his eyes. "Impossible!" someone breathed in the crowd. But Lyra barely heard them. The power building within her was intoxicating, overwhelming. She felt her wolf pressing against her consciousness for the first time in her life, not the broken, sleeping thing she'd always believed herself to have, but something magnificent and strong. Matthias began to shift partially, his human form taking on aspects of his wolf. His hands elongated into claws, his muscles expanded, and his eyes blazed pure gold. The crowd had never seen an alpha fight in partial shift. It was a display of power that left them breathless. Darius's confidence finally cracked. He swung wildly, desperately, but Matthias moved like water around his attacks. When the Alpha King struck back, it was with surgical precision that sent his opponent reeling. The end came quickly after that. Matthias caught Darius's next punch, twisted with inhuman strength, and drove the big man to the arena floor. His claws pressed against his opponent's throat, one movement away from ending the fight forever. "Yield," Matthias commanded, his voice carrying alpha authority that resonated through every wolf in the arena. Darius tried to resist, but the command was irresistible. "I yield," he gasped. The crowd exploded in cheers, but Lyra barely heard them. Her attention was fixed on Lord Garrett, whose face had gone purple with rage. "Cheating!" he screamed, standing in his box. "Magical assistance! The fight is invalid!" "The bond cannot be cheating," Elder Voss replied coldly. "Mates are meant to strengthen each other. This is natural law." "Natural law?" Garrett's voice cracked with hysteria. "I'll show you natural law." To Lyra's horror, he pulled a crossbow from beneath his robes and aimed it directly at the royal box. Not at Matthias in the arena below, but at her. "If I can't have her," Garrett snarled, "then no one can." Time slowed. Lyra heard the twang of the bowstring, saw the bolt flying toward her with deadly accuracy. She should move, should duck, should do something. Instead, she stood perfectly still as power exploded through her. The dormant wolf that had slept within her for 18 years finally awakened fully. Golden light blazed from her skin as she caught the crossbow bolt bare-handed, her enhanced reflexes moving faster than human sight could follow. The arena fell completely silent. Lyra stared at the bolt in her hand, then at Lord Garrett's shocked face. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority she'd never possessed before. "No one owns me," she said, her words ringing across the arena with supernatural power. "Not you, not my stepfather, not anyone." She snapped the crossbow bolt in half with casual strength and let the pieces fall. The golden light around her intensified, and suddenly everyone could see what she truly was. Not a powerless orphan, but a golden wolf. A bloodline so rare it was thought extinct, more powerful than any alpha. "Impossible," Garrett breathed. Matthias vaulted from the arena floor to the royal box in a single superhuman leap, landing beside Lyra with protective fury blazing in his eyes. Guards were already moving to apprehend Garrett, but the damage was done. The secret was out. "A golden wolf!" Elder Voss whispered, his ancient voice filled with wonder. "The legend spoke truly." Matthias turned to face the crowd, pulling Lyra against his side. Before thousands of witnesses, he spoke the words that would change everything. "Behold your queen," he called out, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena. "Lyra, golden wolf, my destined mate, chosen by the moon herself. She who was thought worthless has been revealed as priceless." The crowd erupted in cheers that shook the ancient stones. "Long live the queen!" they chanted. "Long live the Alpha King!" Lyra felt tears streaming down her face as the reality hit her. She was no longer a commodity to be sold or a burden to be endured. She was a queen, accepted by thousands of voices raised in celebration. "Mine," Matthias whispered in her ear, his arms tightening around her. "Yours," she whispered back, finally understanding what the word meant. As Elder Voss formally acknowledged their bond and Garrett was dragged away in chains, Lyra realized that her journey was just beginning. She'd found her power, her voice, and her place in the world. Most importantly, she'd found home. The coronation ceremony was simple by royal standards, but profound in ways that took Lyra's breath away. She knelt in the ancient chapel where generations of werewolf queens had been crowned, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows to paint rainbow patterns across the marble floor. "Do you, Lyra of the Golden Wolf bloodline, accept the sacred duty of queen to the Northern Territories?" Elder Voss asked, his voice echoing in the hallowed space. "I do," she said, her voice steady and clear. When Matthias placed the crown on her head, not the simple circlet she'd worn before, but the true queen's crown with its intricate golden wolves, Lyra felt its weight differently than she had that first day. It no longer felt like a burden she couldn't bear. It felt like coming home. "Rise, Queen Lyra," Matthias said, his eyes shining with pride and love. "My mate, my equal, my heart." The small gathering of witnesses, trusted council members and close allies, erupted in subdued but genuine applause. Mrs. Whitmore dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even the stoic Captain Reynolds looked moved by the ceremony. As they walked back to the palace together, Lyra marvelled at how different everything felt. The servants no longer avoided her eyes or whispered when she passed. They bowed with genuine respect, calling her Your Majesty with warmth rather than obligation. "You're smiling," Matthias observed as they reached their private chambers. "I'm just processing," Lyra said, touching the crown that still felt surreal on her head. 3 weeks ago I was being sold in a marketplace. Now I'm a queen." "Now you're my queen," Matthias corrected, pulling her into his arms. "There's a difference." The golden bond pulsed between them, stronger than ever since her wolf had fully awakened. She could feel his emotions as clearly as her own. His fierce love, his protective instincts, his absolute certainty that she belonged exactly where she was. "I have something to show you," Lyra said, surprising herself with her boldness. She led him to the balcony where they'd first felt their bond manifest. The garden spread below them in the afternoon light, but Lyra's attention was focused inward. "Watch," she said softly. She closed her eyes and let her wolf rise to the surface. The transformation was nothing like the violent, painful descriptions she'd heard from others. Instead, it felt like shedding a disguise she'd worn too long, like finally breathing freely after years of holding her breath. When she opened her eyes, she was standing on 4 legs, her fur shining pure gold in the sunlight. She was larger than most wolves, more elegant, with eyes that held ancient wisdom. Matthias's intake of breath was audible. "Magnificent," he whispered, then shifted into his own wolf form. His wolf was massive, coal-black with those burning golden eyes. Where hers was elegant grace, his was raw power. But when they touched noses, the gentleness was unmistakable. They ran through the gardens together, 2 wolves playing like cubs despite their royal dignity. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt complete, not just human, not just wolf, but both parts of herself unified and whole. When they shifted back, they were breathless and laughing, grass stains on their formal clothes. "The council would be scandalized," Matthias said, brushing leaves from her hair. "Let them be," Lyra replied, feeling giddy with freedom. "I'm still learning how to be myself." That evening, their first official court session as a mated pair brought a dispute between neighbouring packs over territory boundaries. Lyra watched Matthias handle the proceedings with diplomatic skill, but when the older alpha began dismissing the younger pack's concerns, she found herself speaking up. "If I may," she said, standing from her throne beside Matthias. The court fell silent. It was her first time addressing them as Queen, and everyone leaned forward with curiosity. "I understand the concern about traditional boundaries," Lyra continued, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "But from what I've heard, the younger pack's territory has become unlivable due to pollution from the copper mines. Surely the solution isn't to force them to remain in poisoned land, but to help them find new territory while ensuring fair compensation for those who must share." The older alpha's jaw worked as he considered her words. "And how would you suggest we accomplish this, Your Majesty?" Lyra felt a moment of panic. What did she know about territorial disputes or pack politics? But then she remembered her own experience of being displaced, of having no safe place to call home. "Partnership," she said simply. "The younger pack has skilled hunters and craftsmen. Instead of seeing them as a burden, perhaps they could contribute to the older pack's prosperity in exchange for shared territory. Both packs become stronger, and everyone has a safe place to raise their families." Murmurs of approval rippled through the court. The younger pack's alpha stepped forward, hope lighting his features. "Your Majesty speaks wisdom," he said. "We would gladly contribute our skills to mutual prosperity." After several minutes of negotiation, guided by Lyra's framework, both alphas shook hands on a partnership agreement that left everyone satisfied. As the court dispersed, Matthias leaned close to her ear. "Where did that come from?" "I don't know," Lyra admitted. "It just felt right." "You have the heart of a true queen," he said, pride warming his voice. "I knew it from the moment I saw you." That night, in the privacy of their chambers, they shared their first truly intimate moments as mates. The physical bonding was gentle and powerful, sealed by the golden light that danced around them as their souls connected completely. Afterward, lying in Matthias's arms with the mate bond humming contentedly between them, Lyra finally felt safe enough to voice her deepest fears. "What if I'm not enough?" she whispered against his chest. "What if I make mistakes that hurt the kingdom?" "Then we'll fix them together," Matthias said simply. "Being a good ruler isn't about being perfect, Lyra. It's about caring enough to keep trying, keep learning, keep putting your people's needs before your own comfort." "And you think I can do that?" "I know you can," he said, his arms tightening around her. "You've been doing it your whole life, surviving, enduring, protecting the people you love, even when it cost you everything. That's what makes a queen. The next morning brought news that made both their hearts race. Captain Reynolds entered their breakfast room with a grim expression. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing formally. "Lord Garrett has died in his cell. Natural causes according to the physician, but his supporters have scattered across the realm. Intelligence suggests they may be organising some form of resistance." Lyra felt ice settle in her stomach. Resistance to what? "To your rule, your Majesty. There are some who believe a common-born queen, even one of Golden Wolf bloodline, undermines traditional hierarchy. They're calling you an usurper." "Let them come," Matthias said, his voice carrying deadly promise. "We've faced worse." But Lyra shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Violence isn't the answer here." Both men stared at her in surprise. "These people are afraid," she continued, standing from the breakfast table. "Afraid that change means they'll lose their place, their security. Fighting them will only prove their right to fear us." "What do you suggest?" Captain Reynolds asked respectfully. Lyra thought of her own journey, from worthless commodity to valued queen, and the people who had helped her along the way. "We show them," she said simply. "We show them that our rule means prosperity and safety for everyone, not just the nobility. We visit the territories, meet with the common folk, listen to their concerns. We prove through our actions that change can make their lives better, not worse." Matthias studied her face for a long moment, then smiled. "A progress through the kingdom. Brilliant." "You think it will work?" "I think," he said, standing to take her in his arms, "that you're going to be the greatest queen this kingdom has ever known." Over the following weeks, they established new laws protecting anyone from forced marriages or human trafficking, with Lyra's own story serving as the foundation for change. The response from common folk was overwhelmingly positive. Letters poured in from young women thanking their queen for showing them they deserved better than being treated as property. The noble houses were slower to adapt, but even there progress was being made. Lyra's combination of personal strength and diplomatic wisdom was winning over former skeptics one conversation at a time. "You've changed everything," Matthias told her one evening as they reviewed the latest reports from their kingdom. "We've changed everything," Lyra corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you believing in me first." "And I couldn't have built a kingdom worth ruling without you showing me what really matters," he replied. The golden bond pulsed between them, warm and constant, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth building a life around. For the first time since her parents died, Lyra felt truly at peace. She had found her place, her purpose, and her home. More than that, she had learned the most important truth of all. She was worth everything she had been given, and everything she had fought to become. 6 months later, Lyra woke to sunlight streaming through the silk curtains of the royal chambers, the golden rays painting everything in warm honey tones. For a moment she lay still, marvelling at the simple miracle of waking up safe, loved, and home. Matthias's arm tightened around her waist as he stirred beside her, his face peaceful in sleep. Even after all this time, she still couldn't quite believe this was her life, waking up beside the man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "Good morning, my queen," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning, my king," she replied, turning in his arms to face him properly. The golden bond between them hummed with contentment, a constant warm presence that had become as natural as breathing. Their connection had only grown stronger with time, deepening from desperate need to settled certainty. "The council meeting this morning," Matthias said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Are you ready?" Lyra smiled, remembering the nervous girl who had once been terrified of speaking in front of strangers. "I'm looking forward to it," she said, and meant it. They had breakfast together on their private terrace, reviewing the morning's agenda while sharing comfortable silence. The kingdom's business felt less like burden and more like privilege now. The chance to make decisions that would improve lives, protect the vulnerable, create something lasting and good. "The trade agreement with the Eastern Territories has been finalised," Matthias said, passing her the morning correspondence. "Thanks to your suggestion about the artisan exchange programme." "Our suggestion," Lyra corrected automatically. "We're partners in this, remember?" He smiled, that soft expression reserved only for her. "How could I forget?" The morning council session brought news that made both their hearts race, but for the best possible reasons. Captain Reynolds entered with a stack of letters, his usually stern face showing traces of satisfaction. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing formally, "the quarterly reports from across the kingdom." As they reviewed the documents together, a picture emerged of prosperity and peace that exceeded their most optimistic projections. Crime rates had dropped significantly, especially crimes against women and children. The new marriage protection laws had been adopted by 3 neighbouring kingdoms. Trade was flourishing, education programmes were expanding, and for the first time in decades, the common folk reported feeling genuinely hopeful about the future. "There's something else," Captain Reynolds said, his formal mask slipping slightly. "Personal correspondence, quite a lot of it, actually." He gestured to several bags filled with letters, all addressed to Queen Lyra personally. That afternoon, Lyra sat in her private study, reading through the correspondence, letter after letter from young women across the kingdom and beyond, thanking her for showing them they deserved better than being treated as property. Stories of daughters refusing forced marriages, of families choosing love over political convenience, of communities coming together to protect their most vulnerable members. One letter, written in careful handwriting by a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, brought tears to her eyes. "Your Majesty, my stepfather tried to sell me to pay his gambling debts, just like yours did. But when the magistrate heard about it, he said what you went through changed the law, and now I'm safe. I'm learning to read and write properly, and someday I want to help other girls like us. Thank you for showing me that I'm worth more than a handful of coins." "Good news?" Matthias asked from the doorway. "The best news," Lyra said, wiping her eyes and holding up the letter. "We're making a difference." He crossed the room to read over her shoulder, his arms coming around her from behind in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "You're making a difference," he said softly. "You're giving them hope." "We're giving them hope," she corrected, leaning back against his chest. "I couldn't have done any of this without you believing in me first." That evening brought an announcement that changed everything yet again. Lyra had suspected for several days, but the physician's confirmation still left her breathless with joy and terror. "I'm carrying our first child," she told Matthias when they were alone in their chambers. For a moment he went completely still. Then joy blazed across his features with such intensity that the golden bond between them flared bright enough to illuminate the entire room. "A child," he breathed, his hands coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child." "Are you happy?" Lyra asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy?" Matthias laughed, the sound pure joy. "I'm beyond happy. I'm complete." The next morning they announced the pregnancy to their people during the harvest festival. The crowd's celebration was immediate and genuine. Cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, flowers thrown in the air, spontaneous songs of joy and blessing. "Long live the Queen," they chanted. "Long live the royal heir." Standing on the palace balcony, with Matthias's arm around her and their unborn child growing beneath her heart, Lyra felt the magnitude of how far she'd travelled. 6 months ago, she'd been nothing more than damaged goods being sold to the highest bidder. Now she was a beloved queen, carrying the future of the kingdom. "Any regrets?" Matthias asked quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. "Only that it took me so long to believe I deserved this," Lyra replied. A week later, they returned to the place where it all began. The old marketplace had been transformed, according to Lyra's vision, into something unrecognisable from its former self. Where auction platforms had once stood, there was now a beautiful education centre with a library, meeting halls and workshops where young women could learn trades that would give them independence. The shelter wing housed those escaping forced marriages or dangerous situations, providing safety and support until they could build new lives. The Queen's Haven, the brass plaque beside the main entrance read, where every person's worth is recognised and protected. Perfect, Lyra said, running her fingers over the words. She cut the ribbon with ceremonial scissors, but the moment that truly mattered came afterward, when a young girl, no older than Lyra had been when her parents died, approached shyly with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Thank you, Your Majesty," the child whispered. "My mamma says you're the reason she didn't have to marry the bad man." Lyra knelt to accept the flowers, her heart full to overflowing. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma, Your Majesty. And Mama says when I grow up, I can be anything I want to be, just like you." "Your Mama is absolutely right," Lyra said gently. "You can be anything you dream of being." As they walked through the centre together, Matthias pointed to a corner where a small memorial garden had been planted. "For those who didn't make it," he said quietly. "And for those who will," Lyra added, thinking of all the future daughters who would grow up knowing their worth wasn't determined by others' opinions. That evening they stood on their private balcony overlooking the kingdom they had built together. The golden bond between them pulsed gently, a constant reminder of how far they'd travelled from that first meeting in a dusty marketplace. "I love you," Matthias said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love you too," Lyra replied, her hand coming to rest on the small curve of her belly where their child grew. "All of us." As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Lyra reflected on the impossible journey that had brought her here. She'd gone from believing she was worth a handful of coins to understanding she was priceless, not because of her golden wolf bloodline or her crown, but because she had learned to value herself. "Mine," Matthias whispered, pulling her closer. "Yours," she whispered back. "Always yours." "And mine," she added with a smile, claiming her own worth with words that would have been impossible 6 months ago. The golden bond flared one more time, sealing the promise between them. They had found their forever, their home, their perfect happiness. And across the kingdom, in villages and cities, in grand houses and humble cottages, young women looked up at the same stars and dared to dream of being valued, being chosen, being loved not for what they could provide, but for who they truly were. Love like this existed when someone saw your true worth, even when you couldn't see it yourself. It existed in the space between what the world told you that you deserved and what your heart knew was possible. It existed in the courage to trust, to hope, to believe that you were worth fighting for. Where are you listening from tonight? Share your location in the comments below. Let's build our own community of people who know they deserve to be treasured. And if stories like this make your heart feel full, consider subscribing for more tales of love that transforms everything. Because everyone deserves a love story where they're seen as priceless, where they're chosen not despite their flaws, but because of their whole, complicated, beautiful selves. Until next time, remember, you are worth everything you dream of becoming.